Hello, everybody. Hello, attendees. Good afternoon, distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues. Let's wait just for one final minute so that everybody is gathered, and we will start our webinar today. I see that lots of guests have gained access to our webinar. I think everybody is ready to start now. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this vital discussion hosted by the Transatlantic Dialogue Center, Russia's Comeback, Post-War Strategy and Western Responses. My name is DiCianna Sidorenko, and I'm the Director of Research in the Transatlantic Dialogue Center. Today, I will be moderating our meeting. We gather today at a very critical time. Russia is undeniably no longer the same country it was before 2022. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine has not only reshaped the global security architecture, but has also profoundly transformed Russia's internal political and economic landscape. Understanding the trajectory of post-war Russia, how it may seek to reassert itself, what its strategic aims might be, and the nature of the threat it could continue to pose is of major importance and a fundamental necessity for policymakers in Ukraine, the European Union, NATO, and the United States, as they face very complex dilemmas, security dilemmas. How the West prepares and responds to these potential challenges and threats will shape international stability for years to come. That is precisely why we at the Transatlantic Dialogue Center undertook our research project on Russia's role in a post-war world order. We sought to explore the crucial question, what will Russia look like after the war, and how should Ukraine and the West prepare? Over the next 90 minutes, we aim to share the key findings from the research and, importantly, to foster a broader expert discussion on these pressing issues. We are fortunate to have with us a distinguished panel of experts who will share their insights following the presentation. I am pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Maria Domańska. She's a senior fellow at the Warsaw-based Center for Eastern Studies, OSU, specializing in Russian domestic politics with a focus on federal and regional elites, formal and informal aspects of the Russian political system, state propaganda, and domestic determinants of the Kremlin's foreign policy. Between 2012 and 2015, she worked as the head of political section in the Embassy of Poland in Moscow. Dr. Domańska, we are excited to have you today.
Thank you so much for having me here, and it's a great honor. So shall I start now with my...
I will present other speakers, and as soon as I finish the presentation, I will hand over the floor. Thank you. We are also delighted to welcome Juraj Majcin, who is a policy analyst at the European Policy Center in Brussels, where he leads the center's European defense and security projects. His work focuses on European and transatlantic security and defense policy and mobilization of the European defense industry and the broader geopolitical dimensions of security. Juraj, thank you for joining us. Last but not least, it's my pleasure to present Michael DiCianna, a research fellow with the Center for Intermarium Studies at the Institute of World Politics. His research focuses on transatlantic security, the NATO, the Russo-Ukrainian War, and the 21st century technology and its battlefield effects. Michael, welcome to our discussion.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Great. Our goal today is to delve into the potential nature of post-war Russia, the strategic dilemmas it poses, and the necessary responses from the EU, NATO, and the US. So I will begin with a presentation outlining the core conclusions of our research that will be disseminated after the event. Our first finding is that the post-war Russia is poised to remain aggressive. Our central finding is that irrespective of the specific outcomes on the battlefield or the outcomes of peace talks, the fundamental nature of the Russian regime and its foreign policy objectives suggests a high likelihood of continued aggression. Several factors underpin this assessment. You can see them on the slide. The notion that Putin's regime or similar ones in the post-war era are likely to survive and sustain popular support is underpinned by an ideology that combines national pride with the perception of existential struggle with the West. The so-called Russian imperial age is embedded in both elite and public consciousness, forming a pervasive mindset that frames Ukraine and neighboring countries as part of Russia's rightful sphere of influence. This belief has shaped Russian policymaking for centuries and casts these countries as integral to a greater Russia. Due to that, currently, the Russian leadership maintains maximalist demands, including territorial claims, frames the conflict as an existential battle against the West, makes genuine reconciliation or a shift away from hostility highly difficult. Many experts say that polling in an autocratic country is challenging to conduct or decipher because it's going to be hard for people to give genuine answers. However, even the ability to detect the socially acceptable opinion demonstrates the prevailing opinion of the majority that forces others to conform. On the next slide, you can see that throughout the war, we had seen the overwhelming support for the actions of Russian military in Ukraine among Russian population. Even if it is a sign of conformism, it's very important to note that conformism is very highly stabilizing for authoritarian regime, as it fosters social environment where the regime's policies go unchallenged. So it supports the status quo that Kremlin might make post-war. Our next slide shows that Russian society is also not ready for any kind of tangible compromise. The results of the survey indicate that Russians are mostly opposed to any return of territories or other concessions to Ukraine. Instead, they are more supportive of Ukraine's demilitarization, establishment of pro-Russian government in Ukraine, the so-called protection of Russian speakers on its territories. In Ukraine, we deem that acknowledgement of aggressive nature of Russian war and accountability for the actions of Russian army in Ukraine is a prerequisite needed not only for lasting peace with Ukraine, but also a possible sign that Russia is ready for peaceful coexistence on international arena. As you can see on the slide, currently Russian society is not ready for that. On the next slide, you can see very important quote from Andrei Kolesnikov, Russian political expert. In the world of these conformists, there is no collective guilt or even collective responsibility. They cannot influence anything, so they are not guilty of anything. Their position is, this war is unnecessary, but it wasn't us who started it. On the next slide, you can see that while many Russians may not explicitly identify with the regime, they have consolidated around it, viewing the state as a bulwark against Western efforts to destroy Russia. Such consolidation is evident in the surge of public support for Putin and government institutions following major confrontation with the West, including 2014 annexation of Crimea and the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Furthermore, the sustained campaign of aggressive state propaganda and cultivation of hyper-nationalism further entrench revanchist sentiments within Russian society, creating a domestic environment supportive of continued hostility towards Ukraine and West. It also shows a very important thing. If Vladimir Putin dies, his successor will more likely choose similar policies and stick to the same ideology as they are more popular among the people. As simple as that. On the next slide, you can see another quote of DiCianna, a Russian political analyst. She claims that Putin is more afraid of the pro-war opposition more than the liberal one. Because if the battle ceases without prominent gains, the feeling of unfinished business will haunt Russian political landscape. The rise of ultranationalist hardliners and pro-war factions must be very much kept in mind while crafting Western strategies for the post-war Russia. Our next finding is that militarized economy fuels aggression. Our research indicates that Russia's aggressive posture is increasingly supported by the structural transformation of its economy towards militarization. The shift towards a full-fledged war economy is undeniable. We can see it in military spending that exceeds 6% of GDP of 2025. Moreover, there has been a marked increase in production of military hardware, such as advanced tanks, artillery, ammunition. Significantly, a considerable portion of this ammunition is not deployed to the front lines, so it's rather saved for future contingencies. While unprecedented Western sanctions have constrained Russia's access to critical technologies and financial markets, the Russian economy has shown resilience through adaptation, especially shifting trade patterns, energy exports shifting to Asia, and massive state interventions. However, it creates also long-term vulnerabilities like inflation, labor shortages, and unsustainable reliance on defense spending. On our next slide, you can also see that our third finding concludes that sanctions must remain in place post-war just because of it. Lifting them prematurely would risk bolstering Russia's military potential by granting renewed access to Western technology and dual-use goods. Continued, well-enforced sanctions aimed at restricting resources for the military sector and access to critical components remain essential, even as Russia attempts circumvention. Based on everything mentioned before, our paper concludes that Russia will continue to pose a significant and persistent threat, not only to Ukraine, but also to the broader security of Russia's neighbors. The combination of aggressive ideology and a militarized economy points to the fact that Russia presents complex strategic dilemmas, and it demands sustained and adapted responses from Western institutions. That is precisely why we have gathered a distinguished panel of experts with us today. Each brings a wealth of knowledge and unique perspectives on these critical areas of research. I want to hand over the floor to Dr. Maria Domańska. Welcome again. Based on your extensive experience of work in Russia and with Russian establishment and other political questions, I would like to ask you, what key domestic factors within Russia should the EU and NATO and West prioritize when forming long-term strategies towards it?
Thank you so much. Actually, I couldn't agree more with what you have just said about the whole picture. And I would like to stress that indeed domestic political factors are super important if we analyze the overall Russian behavior on the international arena. But I would like to start with saying that I'm deeply convinced that there won't be any post-war in the foreseeable future unless Russia suffers defeat in Ukraine. Unfortunately, there is no smell of that in the air so far. And looking from inside Russia, under Putinism, war has become a natural condition of the Russian state. During Putin's 25-year rule, Russia did not wage wars only for 5 years. And after he came to power, war has always been the easiest way to guarantee domestic political legitimacy for the growingly oppressive regime. This kind of regime is unable to produce sustainable economic growth, and it parasites on the resources and on the population. And now what we see is that Putin has made himself a hostage to the war. He has invested far too much in the very idea of an ultimate Russian victory that has already cost lives of hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers. And he has committed countless war crimes and declared he's ready to set the world on fire to make Russia great again. And what is really very important, and I'm now like thinking about some stereotypes and myths in the West that still are present about Russia, that although Putin often appeals to the Soviet legacy, Russia in 2025 resembles much more the Nazi Germany than the Soviet Union because of its revanchism, militarism, because there is no more the anti-war vaccine that was so characteristic of the Soviet public. This is important because many people still do not see this domestic evolution in Russia, and they still think that if the West could relatively peacefully coexist with the Soviet Union after 1945, it can be the same with Russia. It can't. Also because unlike the Soviet Union, Russia is a personalist dictatorship, and there is no institutional checks and balances against the arbitrary will of the leader. And Putin clearly presented his strategic goals in the ultimatums he sent to the US and NATO in December 2021. It's true, and his goals have not changed since then. Among other things, he claims he demands a security buffer zone in Central Europe, like in Poland, in the Baltic states, and other post-1997 NATO member states. So there is a very tight link between what is happening inside Russia and in its foreign policy. But also, what is super important is that Russian historical narratives and imperial ideas, as you have said, will continue to influence Russia's future relations with the EU and Ukraine, unless this imperial project is compromised for good and some kind of political liberalization takes place in Russia. Because these imperial narratives resonate powerfully among the Russian public, I totally agree. And these narratives have always compensated for the mass disenfranchisement of Russian citizens. So under the oppressive regime, the only available form of course, a fake political agency is the participation in the might of the state that instills fear abroad. And this is visible also in the service of public opinion. Russians are proud of their country that instills fear abroad. So this is Russian messianism that is quite popular. The idea of Russian superiority over other nations, the historical revanchism, some kind of Weimar syndrome due to the lost Cold War, and the constant feeling of threat from outside. Of course, all of these sentiments are deliberately being stoked from above. And these are the ideas that serve to insulate Russians against the virus of liberal democracy, which is perceived as an existential threat to the corrupt neo-patrimonial regime, which is based on lawlessness and violence. And these aggressive ideas will continue to be stoked by the regime, no matter if Russia wins this war or loses it, because the very definition of victory or defeat is another topic to discuss. It's quite complex, but a lot depends on how the state propaganda will present a victory or a defeat. Because after this war, I think that there will be another one sooner or later. If the Kremlin decision makers feel they can start another war without destroying the Russian state. Unfortunately, the idea of the war against NATO has already found its place in the Russian official discourse. This is the bad news. The good news is that the better we are prepared for a possible war, the less likely it will start. So what the West needs to do, taking into account the current state of Russian foreign policy, but above all the domestic situation, is to convince Putin and his cronies that the continuation of the war will end in the regime's collapse. Now they believe the opposite to a large extent because the West is so inconsistent in helping Ukraine and introducing harsh economic sanctions. A couple of words about the Russian economy in its current state. Although Russia is still not a fully militarized state, many processes has gone too far to just simply re-switch the country to the peace mode again after some kind of peace agreement. A large part of the economy works for the army. A large part of the so-called ruling elite makes huge money on war. A new social layer of the beneficiaries of war has been deliberately grown by the Kremlin. There is also an ambitious long-term project of social engineering in a neo-totalitarian spirit, I would say. And this is particularly dangerous in the case of children and youth. There is mass indoctrination, militarization of education, and the so-called patriotic upbringing. And these young people are currently being taught to hate and to fight. And this brings me to the conclusion that Russia will remain an existential threat to Europe as long as it remains authoritarian. It will remain imperial also as long as it remains authoritarian. And the security order in Europe will not be restored without bringing competitive politics and pluralism into the Russian political system. Russia will not abandon war as a tool of its foreign policy unless a more pluralistic model based on institutional checks and balances emerges in the country. This model should be able to seek legitimacy in economic growth instead of seeking it endlessly in aggressive wars. As long as Russia remains autocracy, domestic repression and foreign aggression will continue to go hand in hand. The desired minimum would be, well, post-war or post-Putin, you name it, but the desired minimum plan of normalize the situation in the future would be to prevent one person sitting in the Kremlin from taking arbitrary decisions that are crucial for the country and for the international security order without any scrutiny, at least from a broader elite. Now, the situation is that Putin himself or like three more people take decisions and no one actually knows what these decisions will be like. And that's why any future normalization of the West's relations with Russia should be conditioned not only on reinstating Ukraine's territorial integrity, paying reparations, etc., like obvious things, but also on domestic liberalization in Russia. It is an unpopular idea because it is so difficult and no one actually wants to hear about it in the West. But for me, it's a very logical approach to not to lift sanctions or to introduce new sanctions for mass violations of human rights, for example, and to keep them in force unless, for example, the new regime, the post-Putin regime, releases political prisoners, revokes repressive laws, and organizes competitive elections. And these things can be done like really overnight or within a very short period of time. Pluralism in Russia, therefore, like understood like at least political competition between groups of interest, if not political competition in a broader population, this is the key to Europe's security in the longer run. The problem is that the West fears a possible political turmoil in Russia. This fetish of Russia's stability is present there, and this is quite a powerful tool of reflexive control over Western leaders. But the West should fear not Russia's instability, but rather the stable Russia's autocracy. And of course, the last but not least point is that Russia will not truly change unless it confronts and overcomes its totalitarian and imperial past. And this is a super tricky topic, even for Russian democratic groups, including intellectuals. There is a direct link between the lack of confrontation with the Soviet totalitarianism and the collective responsibility of Russians for the type of political regime that has formed in the country under Putin. And you have brilliantly diagnosed it. But very few people in Russia and outside Russia, among the Russian political exiles, are actually ready to raise this topic with their fellow citizens, which will make the very long and difficult process of overcoming the current situation and the long-term problems it will make this process even more difficult and even longer. And if we look at the example of the Nazi Germany, it took like decades to change the country, and this process has never been actually over. So with Russia, it will be much more difficult, much more bumpy, and the only like viable long-term strategy of the West that I see now, given all these complex domestic processes and like the deep structures of Putinism, would be to invest heavily in the European defense and to invest heavily in the defense of Ukraine. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Domańska. I really, those contributions of yours were excellent. Firstly, what I would like to say, and I really liked one point of yours about how, and we get lots of questions like this, how do we actually see in the West that Russia is changing? The pluralism is very simple, simple answer. And I think it's crucially that you highlighted that that Russia is able to do this overnight. I also would like to build upon this thought and maybe switch to Juraj, Majcin. To what extent, in your opinion, is there shared understanding across Europe today regarding the scale and urgency of the Russian threat? And in Europe, do European countries understand how to really balance out those economic relations with Russia, economic interests, and political relations with it, especially sanctions?
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Also, first, I would like to really comment your report. I think it's wonderful. It's a great 360-degree view of overview of what Russia looks like and what the future is. So, congratulations on this amazing piece of work. Well, so to respond to your question, I think, and I really like the diagnosis by the Maria has described that Russia as a country with radicalized, indoctrinated population with imperial ambitions that extend beyond Ukraine. That's really clear. And I think, in Brussels, I think, just speaking from the Brussels bubble, I think there is now a realization that which was not here just a few years ago, that Russia will remain an existential threat to Europe. And that's why we have all these discussions on European defense, on NATO. But I think our approach is very reactive. I think we should be more proactive and just going back to history. I went to George Kennan, who wrote this famous long telegram, and that he was published in Foreign Affairs, the sources of Soviet contact. And we clearly see that the sources of current Russia's contact is this willingness to expand their empire. And we know that this is not only about Ukraine, but one of the conditions that Putin put to the negotiations before he unleashed the war was a return of NATO borders or NATO infrastructure prior to 1997, which would be, of course, detrimental to secure and usually dangerous move to security of Central and Eastern Europe. So I think we should also base our strategy more on containment of Russia, especially we all talk a lot about global south. I think that's another dimension. I don't think we're losing the battle of narratives there. This is something we have to focus on, but also first and foremost, we should ensure that the enlargement process and Europe and partner countries of the European Union, like Moldova, like Georgia, are supported, and the European Union ensures that, and of course Ukraine, that democracy and thrives in that country. That's why I think that this is a very important point. Then also one of the strategies should be deterrence, and this is, I think, what just to build up on what Maria said. Putin will unleash another aggression against NATO only if he will be sure that this won't lead to destruction of Russia's state. I think currently we can say that we should build up, and I think we should beef our defense and deterrence capacities, but NATO deterrence has worked. The only problem is that Russia is now a war economy. So while they can produce 1,500 tanks in a year, United States can produce 135, as Mark Rutte has said. So I think what will be very crucial is to ensure that we really, because the European Commission has now unveiled this proposition for 800 billion euros of defense investments, to, of course, deter Russia, to build capacities. But if you think about it, this is not money you can put in a bank. This is just a relaxation of fiscal rules, and we still don't have a clear strategy on how we beef our deterrence. So I hope that the next NATO summit in The Hague will agree on some capability targets that will be able to implement the new regional defense plans. We have to send a clear message to Russia that they cannot really attack a NATO member, and that there will be a solid NATO response. That's the first point. Second point is, of course, the elephant in the room here, which is the role of the United States, and whether the United States will, and maybe Michael can then talk about it, remain a guarantor of European security. I think Europeans should be doing more, especially within the framework of the new coalition of the willing. There you can see unprecedented unity still with UK, with France, but also countries like Germany has completely revised its position on defense. So you clearly see a willingness to do more on that front. But I think it will be interesting to see what the United States position and how Donald Trump will position himself vis-a-vis Russia. The so-called peace negotiations haven't really made a successful end. So I really in Brussels, what is currently being discussed is what is the new sanctions if Russia doesn't respond to the proposal for negotiations that President Zelensky said to Putin that he will meet him in Istanbul. So I think we'll have to adapt on sanctions as well, and maybe if the US will unleash those secondary sanctions, Europe will have to face another serious decisions, especially on the front of energy. European Union has recently presented a roadmap for complete independence from Russia's energy sources, which I think is something that can also present a link between what Donald Trump currently plans to do, and I think the people around him, have this idea of lowering the price of oil, and maybe this will be also the discussion of Donald Trump's trip in the Middle East. So I think we have to really tackle, and we have to use every possible avenue to prevent Russia from financing its war economy. So overall, I think there is a realization now made in Europe. The problem is, and that's also the European problem, is the different threat perception across Europe. You have, and I think there's not much you can do about it, because still Poland will be more exposed than, for instance, Spain, and that's why in Spain they say that they would increase the defense spending, but they would also include as defense spending climate change adaptation and cybersecurity. But this is something that we have to work more on. That's the strategic culture in Europe, which I think we made huge progress on. But still, there is this lack of recognition of the threats from countries further from the front line. But on the other hand, they have to realize that we are in a hybrid war, or the kinetic phase the hot phase is in Ukraine, but no country is safe from Russia's disinformation, assassination attacks against our infrastructure. And I think it will be the huge task for European politicians will be to reconcile these different threat perceptions within Europe, and to make everyone chip in, every government also persuading their citizens that we need to make this sort of sacrifices. And as I know, as Mark Rutte said, it's not about spending much less on social care and well-being. It's about spending little less, because what is more sustainable overall than peace, and then investing in our own security. And also, I think, and we had an interesting event in Brussels with the DPC, with Rob Bauer, former head of or chair of NATO Military Committee, because this discussion is not only about money. There are now multiple proposals on how to raise money, but I think that and what also Rob Bauer said, at the time when citizens could just expect that by paying taxes, someone else will take care of their security, meaning police and law enforcement of the internal security, and armed forces taking care of the external security. This won't work anymore, and that's why we see many countries reinstating conscription or building more reserves. I think this will be another challenging issue for policymakers to make sure that we also have enough personnel and capacities and reserve for people to chip in for collective security. So that's why I think the Nordic models are quite good to follow. I think there's a lot of inspiration that we can take from Finland, for instance, because I think people must have this flexibility between keeping their own private careers but also working in the military. So it's also, we should keep in mind that it's not only about money, but it's also about this realization of citizens that they're also security actors. So overall I think there is realization now, but still a lot of decisions have to be made still on the European front. We see big conferences, big summits, but then we have discussions on European Defense Industrial Program, which is one small pot of money, 1.5 billion to stimulate European defense industry. And then we can agree on how on the percentage of non-European goods procured, or then we discuss UK-EU defense cooperation, and it's still somehow stalled over discussions on fisheries. And I could go on like that. We want European single policy on Russia. Then I think now overall we agree on European sanctions. Now, as we saw in FT, they are looking into ways how to bypass potential Russia's veto. But when Kaja Kallas is more vocal, or she comes up with an initiative to collect this 40 billion for Ukraine, then she's sometimes met with harsh criticism. So I think it will require greater coordination between our decision what will be the role of member states here and how much the European institutions will be involved in all of this. But then this will be just my overview of where we currently stand in Europe on Russia.
Thank you very much, Juraj, for your contribution. You left us with many thoughts, really, and many questions. Here, I would like to tell the audience that if you have any concrete questions to any certain speaker, please leave them in the comment section and we will start Q&A from them. Here, I would like also ask Juraj, you mentioned that electorate should be ready to sacrifices for defense. Do we see that politicians are ready to talk about that? This is not popular at all, and we see the rise of populism in Europe. How do governments really tackle that? And especially, we see that lots of governments need to do that in lots of different countries around Europe. And a huge challenge here is really the decision making. Is there any change with the decision making right now in Europe? Are there any scenarios on how we can change that situation really and make sure that everybody is on the same line essentially?
That's a very good point. I think this is spot on, because we can say how much unity we have, but look at, for instance, at this current situation in France, where President Macron is leader abroad, but he can't pass budget, which is a substantial portion of all the effort to beef up European defense spending. So in Germany, I think it takes really political leadership. So if we look at the new German Chancellor Merz, he was able to, even with the previous constellation of Bundestag, to pass the revision of German constitution to get rid of the debt brake. That I think was a very good move. So there but this requires solid political leadership and communication from the political leaders, which sometimes doesn't work. There are also people like in Spain, or Pedro Sanchez, who, as I mentioned, said they would not rush with defense spending, and they would look into climate change or cybersecurity. And let's not forget that we have a new defense commissioner. But the first question asked to the new defense commissioner, Kubilius, was not about defense, but during his hearing in European Parliament, but was about the floods in Valencia and the botched response by Spanish authorities. So I think because in some states it's not very difficult. For instance, in Poland, everyone sort of agrees that defense spending is important. Also in countries further north, to like Finland or Sweden, or Norway. But then the diplomatic discussions arises in countries further from the front line, and also with those that have little space to go in depth. This is in particular countries like France or Italy or Spain, and I don't think politicians are doing good job. I don't think the discussions have started, and it's in countries further from the front line. This is not being discussed enough, and we feel there is a bit of discontent between what's happening in Brussels and what happens in these countries. That's why I think it will be a mistake to present this only as defense spending. I think now it will require discussions about resilience, about precisely things that people care about. And I think that what we saw in Spain with the blackout, this could have been used by political leaders in Spain. It wasn't, to explain why resilience is important. If this was caused by cyber attack, we would face similar problems and similar challenges as it was with the blackout. So I don't think that this is being done enough, and I think it's a high time for politicians to do it. Also, just to finish with Ursula von der Leyen, I don't know if you know, but there was this European preparedness strategy, and one of the proposals was that you must have this emergency back prepared. But it was so badly presented that even in my family, people were asking me, are we really going into war? What shall we do? I think the strategic communication, we're not doing well on that front. So I think more should be definitely, and it's mostly for policymakers and politicians to do something about it.
Great answer. Thank you very much. I think here we need to switch to the American point of view. We have seen that the Europeans are getting ready, but what about the US? How does it see the potential European autonomy, and how does it see the possible normalization of relations with Russia, especially under this administration of Donald Trump? I would like to hand over the floor to Michael DiCianna to answer those questions.
Hello. I'm going to begin by saying I don't speak for the Institute of World Politics or any of the organizations I consult with, U.S. government, U.S. Department of Defense. It's important to remember, as especially you saw in the first 100 days, especially the first 50 days of the Trump administration, a sort of effort to begin normalizing relations between Russia after the sort of the Biden freeze. The Trump administration, as a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, Matthew Continetti, pointed out, the Trump administration is now the 5th American administration in a row, including the first Trump administration, to try to normalize relations with Russia. Going back even during the Cold War, during the Nixon-Ford era of détente, which continued to the Carter administration, the U.S. has almost always tried to have some sort of normal relationship with Russia or the Soviet Union, with the exception of during the Reagan administration and like a sort of a full court press to win the Cold War. There's a degree of normality to that, that the U.S. obviously sees in Russia a nuclear peer competitor, regardless of Russian political aims. There's obviously some need for some sort of normalization with Russia, or some sort of diplomatic communication of Russia on that regard. But as we saw in the previous five administrations, Russia almost always does something to frustrate U.S. efforts to show that it's not serious about any sort of cooperation. And I think you're beginning to see the cracks in that relationship now. There's been reporting from a number of different outlets, Financial Times, a small journal called The Dispatch, that says Donald Trump has started to reach out to advisors and figure out what has changed, sort of what Dr. Domańska spoke about. Putin has changed, and Trump is coming around to that realization that the Putin of 2025 is not the Putin he met and sort of was personally jovial with in 2017, 2018, 2019. Hopefully, the United States, the current administration is going to begin realizing that Russia is not a partner for peace in Ukraine. Trump's aversion to the war is a very personal issue. He takes it as a point of pride. He often repeats that the full-scale invasion would not have taken place if he was president, and he wants to end the war quickly. His statements are often bombastic, but that's sort of his character, so I don't think we should over-reflect on that. But there might be an inflection point coming up, or at least somewhat of a turning point. We'll see how this Thursday presentation goes. We'll see how President Zelensky handles the Russian rejection of serious peace talks in Istanbul, and how he plays that in Washington, and see if the U.S. turns a corner. Broadly, obviously, Trump's statements on NATO are one of his more consistent policy points he's had in his political career, going back to the 80s, 90s, in his first flirtation with running for president in the Reform Party. Trump sees NATO as a drag, especially since the end of the Cold War. He has a transactional view of alliances. But more important, I think we need to understand that the Trump administration views the primary element of American power as economic and trade, not military. We're seeing that in how he negotiates with the People's Republic of China. While he might have a Pentagon that's sort of a mix between Asia pivoters and American isolationists, and also in the State Department he has that, his primary concern personally with China seems to be entirely on the economic front. And the military is a sort of a subsidiary that Trump does believe in having a stronger American military, but more important, he believes in having a stronger American industrial base. I'm not going to adjudicate on those things, but that's important to realize when you see how he criticizes NATO, criticizes NATO members that have not hit the 2% spending goal, how Secretary of State Marco Rubio has pushed saying there should be a 3, 4, 5% spending goal for NATO. That's a lot less of a strategic problem for the United States, in that they expect, an equal share of European blood being shed in a potential conflict to defend NATO. And more, it could be seen strictly as economic. If you start seeing NATO states hitting those spending targets, which unfortunately, the 2% agreed on in 2014 in Wales is drastically outdated, and it's frustrating to see prominent NATO members like the United Kingdom and France act like as if hitting 2.5% in the next year, or Germany's goal to hit 3.5, and I think an 8-year, 10-year target. That's inadequate. But if you start seeing NATO members hitting 4-5% spending on GDP, and also for those who are tracking it, important defense spending, like defense spending on probably keeping with the model of Wales laid out of 20% of defense spending on equipment, you'll start to see a less harsh criticism from some elements of the Trump administration, some elements of the American right. There's a different wing of the American right nowadays that'll always be hostile towards defending Europe or defending our U.S. obligations abroad. That might just be an intractable point of view. But with Trump, the people around him who believe that the U.S. maybe needs to focus more on the Indo-Pacific, but still has commitments it needs to honor in the Middle East and Europe, seeing partners move towards those goals is helpful. It's why you don't see as much Trump criticism directed at Poland or the Baltic states, Finland. We've actually seen President Stubb of Finland and Trump seem to have an amicable relationship. Maybe that's because the president of Finland also golfs, and that sort of personal relationship matters a lot with Trump. But yeah, if that economic tie-in becomes less of an issue, you'll see less strain in the transatlantic relationship. Trump yesterday also he repeated his comments criticizing the U.S. trade relationship with the European Union. Again, it's an economic issue. The strategic issue that many of us see married to it is secondary to how Trump views it. So broader European autonomy, I think, the other hand, the U.S. will regret a trade-off in the long run if the U.S. stops supporting European security. If the original promise of NATO, you keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down, with the exception of the Germans down category, which obviously the U.S. would like to see a reversal on that. If the Americans aren't in Europe, I think the U.S. will regret long-term the ability the U.S. has had to sort of smooth out and make irrelevant to some degree intra-European politics and security concerns that'll certainly come to the forefront if the U.S. backs down. I see a common question about, more pro-Russian governments in Europe, specifically in Hungary and Slovakia, and in the recent emerging story, I think we can say about Hungarian Secret Service officers working in Ukraine. A troubling story to say the least. If the U.S. isn't involved in NATO, that sort of friction that exists between NATO members, which it has been a part of the alliance for a long time. Greece and Turkey, of course, are both NATO members, but have had friction, we'll say at the least. Those issues will come out more, and the U.S. and Europe will regret the Washington departing from the Transatlantic Alliance. But in a way, the ball is in Europe's court. There's been positive movement in many European countries for defense spending. I still think it's wholly inadequate on the whole. European investment in defense production is a major concern. The production of basic things like artillery shells, missiles. Particular interest in mine is Europe's investment in air defense systems is essentially non-existent. Germany and several other partners have some plans to acquire some domestic products, acquire some Israeli products, but outside of relying on Patriot missile systems, Aegis Ashore, and THAAD, all of these are U.S. productions. Europe's woefully unprepared for a Russian barrage, as we've seen from the devastation that's reached daily now on Ukraine. If you can imagine that towards a NATO capital, there's not enough Patriot batteries. There's not enough short and intermediate range air defenses in Europe, and in the R&D department, Europe is 40 years behind the curve in some ways, behind the curve in that, and that's problematic. You'll need to see that adjusted. Troop sizes need to be reconsidered. The theater needs to be considered. There's threats to the Suwalki Gap through Poland to Lithuania to Kaliningrad. There's like the threat to Estonia, the threat to Poland broadly. We haven't discussed it here, but there's the problems that Russia could cause in the Balkans with NATO K-Force there through the Russian partnership with Serbia. The Europe needs to be more creative about how it's going to spend for defense, and also sort of, pun intended, will bite the bullet and realize there's going to be serious costs domestically for funding that. And finally, we spoke a bit about deterrence today. I'm actually of the mind now that I think deterrence in the conventional sense might be lost of Russia. This is part of how Russia's transformed domestically, internally, how Putin's thinking has changed, and how Putin's inevitable successor. We talked about it a couple of times. She said, people here said, if Putin dies, of course, Putin will eventually be out of power. How that comes about remains to be seen. He is a few years past the life expectancy of the average Russian male, and father time is undefeated. So we should be talking increasingly about what is post-Putin, not when is post-Putin. But is it on the deterrence? Russia might be past deterring. And what I mean by that is Russia's war in Ukraine has been disastrous for the Russian military in a number of ways, and it's had a hard time learning tactical lessons from the war, or at least applying those tactical lessons broadly. But it has learned that it has the force of arms. It is still committed to the idea that eventually it will break Western will and break the Western alliance. If Moscow sees cracks in the Western alliance now, that's a better sign for it to continue on for an effort towards a NATO country than any weight of arms arrayed against it. Actually, it's correct to say that Russia won't go to war if it thinks war will be the destruction of the Russian state, obviously, but Russia's sort of, in the Clausewitzian sense of war as a continuation of policy by other means, Russia's really short of other means to inflict policy change on European capitals. It's not through destruction. Yeah, obviously it has its energy politics, but in a way that's just a secondary subset of how Russia wages war now. It's gray zone tactics, as they're sometimes called, just another way for Russia to wage war. In a way, Russia is not only rhetorically at war with NATO, but increasingly, I think, committed to, at some point, it's going to have to. And the issue that NATO has is not only might it lose a war with Russia and lose a war in some small ways, such as conceding ground in Poland or Estonia to Russian occupation, which would be shameful alone. But even if Russia is defeated in a rushed attempt to, say, push a gap through Kaliningrad and the Russian military is destroyed, the damage that will inflict economically in cost of human lives on Poland, on Europe, needs to be considered, because it might happen regardless of our ability to defeat that Russian push. And politically, I don't know if Europe is prepared for even a really costly victory against Russian aggression. I don't know if the United States is either. Europe and the United States have not seen a major ground war since 1945, or a major naval war. The lasting, lingering effects of that will be dramatic. And we need to start considering that Russia might be already bought in and just is waiting for the right moment. And even if that moment isn't right for Russia, they still might seize it. They might perceive it as correct. They might lunge in whatever direction. There's a number of geographic theaters they could operate in. It might beat the Russians, but it also might do incredible, hard to imagine long-term damage to the European Union and the European project.
Thank you very much, Michael. Actually, your last point is really interesting, is that it might be a fully logical step, but the war against Ukraine also seemed like a very, very logical step for Russia to do, because of the whole sanctions, because of the military support of Ukraine and so on. So even sometimes we see that it might be illogical, that many considerations show that it is against all prerequisites, but still Russia managed to do it once, it could do it twice. As you are an expert in the defense part in Russia-Ukrainian war especially, I would like to direct one of the questions that was asked in Google Forms before the event, during the registration. There was such a question: are there any detailed studies, models, or expert assessments that estimate Russia's capacity to sustain its war effort under different scenarios, such as best case, average, and worst case projections? So here the person asks literally, how is the economy ready? Is the Russia's capacity? Is it in Russia's capacity to attack NATO in its current state, or how much time it could potentially be for it? If you may, we have like 5 minutes for these questions, and then we will turn to Q&A, or we can continue with comments from our speakers, because I see that many points were getting a reaction.
Well, I can answer that really quickly. I actually haven't read it if there's most recent. The Estonian Military Intelligence Agency, which I can't remember the name of now. I think it translates literally to Estonian Military Intelligence. They produce, I believe it's an annual report. They have an unclassified version of it on Russian military threat. They were one of the first to send up the alarm bell in late 2022 that the Russian military would likely reconstitute much faster than we expected, even after the devastating losses we saw in the Battle of Kyiv or the expulsion of Russian forces from Kharkiv and Kherson. They were right. The Russians have been able to pull out things as old as T-55 tanks out of storage and send them towards the front line. Russian recruitment was able to keep up. Russia's been pretty good, my understanding, at recovering and repairing vehicles. The static nature of the front line, and it allows that for a way that a more mobile front line would not. A tank gets knocked out, but you're still, even under the threat of drones and artillery, still able to recover it using armored recovery vehicles. The Institute for the Study of War has published a lot about Russia's reconstitution. The comments on how long Russia can economically sustain the war. I'm not an economist. Many economists and economic advisors have given various deadlines. In Ukraine, General Budanov has said several times that there's like a 2026, 2027 deadline. I'm not saying I don't put any faith in those things. I'm sure, again, I'm not an economist. There's great reasons for why Russia can't sustain the war economically. I'm hesitant to rely on that as a surety for a number of reasons. The big one is we haven't touched on it yet. The support Beijing has given for Russia has not been as obvious as the support Iran and the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea has, but it's significant. We know certain parts of it. They supply technology. the weight of economic support that China has, is also as the world's biggest manufacturer, is a massive variable in how long Russia can continue economically sustaining this war. And secondary sanctions are part of punishing that. There's a number of things that need to be done about that. But that, as long as China exists and is an ally to Russia, Russia has some degree of a backstop. The trade-off is Russia is, of course, mortgaging its future for China. And I think I'd love to hear what other panelists have to say. My understanding is that there are probably elements of Russian elite that do not like that they're mortgaging their future to China, but at the same time they are. So they might dislike it for a number of chauvinistic reasons, but they're doing it, and we'll see how long they continue to do that.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Your topics really raised many questions and many thoughts in our speakers. Maria, I'd like to give floor to you and your thoughts.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the speeches of the other speakers. It was super brilliant. Well, just two short points on what you have said. The whole point with Russia's possible war against NATO is that Russia can be tempted to try our solidarity and to attack a NATO country only if it expects no significant reaction. So if it sees that the West, Europe, is deeply divided and pacifist in a negative sense of this word. So the whole point is that we should avoid fighting with Russia, and I totally agree. I don't want a costly victory. I have no war at all, and this is quite rational. But avoiding the war is impossible through the idea of dialogue and talking to Russia. First, because appeals for dialogue and compromise are perceived in the Kremlin as a sign of weakness and as a green light to further aggression. So it's counterproductive. And also, I think that calls for dialogue and negotiations and compromise are totally senseless, because there is actually no room for any compromise or negotiations if the sovereignty of states and their security, hard security, is at stake. So I think that deterrence is the right path. We can launch a dialogue with Russia when Russia is really ready to make concessions and to resign from its aggressive foreign policy. It will not happen unless it feels defeated and unless the state coffers are empty. And it's also important in the context of sanctions, why we shouldn't lift sanctions as long as Russia continues its aggressive foreign policy in one way or another, because keeping sanctions in force gives us necessary time to prepare a really viable line of defense and deterrence. We mustn't let Russia to rebuild its military in any time horizon. I would like also to comment briefly on what Juraj said about, I totally agree that politicians don't do the right job in strategic communications with their electorates. It's far worse than it could be and should be. But my understanding is that actually European citizens are much more mature than politicians present them. And there are some surveys of public opinion in European countries. I can't name them off the top of my head right now, but recently there was a survey done by a UK-based think tank. And the result is as following: the majority of the European nations, the European electorates, are quite sure that there will be a war sooner or later within a time horizon of several or up to 10 years in Europe. So people understand the threat. At the same time, the majority of them is quite sure that their army will not be able to defend them. So I would say that saying that Europeans are not ready to discuss difficult topics is just a lame excuse for politicians. And I think that like a proper organization of total defense or civilian defense would be a right answer, because you don't have to panic if you are confronted with this prospect or possibility of a war. You should be prepared, and once you are prepared, the war becomes far too costly for a potential aggressor. And this is I think we should aim to achieve precisely this goal, like general public's resilience. And this would be a very powerful signal sent to Moscow that don't dare you, because if you try to do it, you will lose, like immediately, and you will pay a great price for that. And my last sentence, Russians would have never attacked Ukraine if they had expected a 3-year or 4-year war, right? I mean, they expected a quick victory. And this was a huge miscalculation, and we should avoid this kind of miscalculation in the case of a possible Russia's attack against us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your input. Here, I would like to redirect the space for Juraj Majcin. I believe he has raised the hand just after you, Maria, and then we will return to Michael.
Yes, just a compliment to what Maria has. I agree that and if you look at different opinion polls, most of the large majorities of Europeans stand behind Ukraine. Also, think that security is important and politicians should act upon it. I think I also read many times it's just an excuse for politicians not to do serious decisions. But I think even it's becoming more of a common wisdom that Europe is not at war, but it's not at peace with Russia, and we need to reckon with it. So, but the question is about the rise of nationalism, but also populist movements across Europe that are links to Russia and are sort of Trojan horses within Europe. Michael has mentioned my home country, Slovakia, but also Hungary, that can undermine European unity, and we tend to regard Europe as a unitary or homogeneous object. But actually, there are dangerous forces like Viktor Orban's Hungary, and that episode with Hungarian intelligence officer in Ukraine is quite telling of the threats we're living in. And I just wanted to add also to what Michael has said about deterring Russia. And there was a question about Russia's capabilities and whether it's actually able to attack a NATO country. And I think we often forget the nuclear dimension here, because how the West uses the nuclear deterrence, it's more subtle. It's never to be that much on display. But Russia, we saw especially in Ukraine, has many times used nuclear cyber rattling to slow down, especially with Biden administration, decision-making processes on provision of some arms to Ukraine, notably ATACMS, and we know how Russia reacted when U.S. authorized the use of ATACMS. Then they conducted a strike with a non-nuclear armed Oreshnik at Dnipro. And I think my fear is that Russia may, because there is wisdom, and some commentators say that Russia would only use nuclear weapons only if it was cornered in Ukraine, for instance, or elsewhere. But there's also a hypothesis that Russia may attempt conducting a limited nuclear strike before or as part of the initial attack against NATO to deter allied response. And I think this is it's really a blind spot of European security. And we know that the US withdrew from INF agreement, and because Russia has developed this ground-launched cruise missiles and ballistic missiles of intermediate range. And currently, no European, well, not France, now the UK have this capability. So we don't have that nuclear flexibility that Russia has. And this can create a vulnerability for us, an opportunity for Russia to exploit. So I think now with France's calls for extending the French nuclear deterrence to northern and eastern flanks of NATO, I think France should consider developing their or upgrading their nuclear arsenal to deter also also Russia, but of course in full compatibility with the U.S. nuclear guarantees for NATO. Just as a small addition.
Thank you. The nuclear aspect is indeed very important. Here, I'd like to redirect the floor to Michael. I believe he has the answer to some of the thoughts.
I'll actually speak first to the nuclear topic because this is something I've considered a lot, and it's an important point of discussion. France. France is making some efforts to modernize its nuclear arsenal. They're investing in new submarines and new missiles. Um, Frankly, I think it'd be wise in the UK as well. Also, the US UK is of course designing new nuclear submarines as part of the AUKUS deal with the United States and Australia, though the timeline for delivery on those isn't quite adequate, at least on the Australian side. I'm not as familiar on the UK's receiving of its new submarine platforms. I think both of the European nuclear powers should strongly consider increasing the size of their nuclear arsenal as a deterrent effect. And of course, working on better sharing arrangements. The US has had sharing arrangements with NATO powers before. France, in my understanding, has not had as many. It's extending its deterrence, but I don't believe it's extending its allowing of other NATO members to have a use of its nuclear dyads. It's an extreme topic to talk about, but it's important too. So I hope that'll factor into the European discussion, modernizing, increasing, and allowing for sharing with Eastern flank members of NATO. Broadly on deterrence, I want to clarify. Obviously, deterrence should be the goal of keeping Russia out of NATO. Deterrence failed to keep Russia out of Ukraine. It cannot fail again. When I say that deterrence might be past us, if Russia sees itself at war, not just with Ukraine, but with NATO, even if it's not, in a way, it is kinetically at war with NATO. If you look at the incidents of sabotage, I talked about the term gray zone warfare. I hate the term gray zone warfare. It's an accurate description of what's happening if it is something below full-scale formation warfare being waged, but I do not like gray zone warfare as a term because European countries and the United States have used it as a way to not do anything about it. There's no other way to put it. It's terrorism. If we called it terrorism, we'd have to respond to it under the legal and military measures in which we respond to terrorism when it's conducted by Islamist groups. And we should do that when it's Russia. Obviously, every time Russia cuts a cable in the Baltic Sea or tries to, sabotage a factory or breaks the window of a Estonian head of government, we can't bomb St. Petersburg, but we need to respond to it much more forcefully than the U.S. Intelligence assessments that came out that sort of were wishy-washy about, oh, well, sure, it was a Chinese flagged Russian crude vessel that dragged anchor for 60 miles across the Baltic Sea, but we can't quite say it was sabotage. That's ridiculous. That's not a adequate way to fight and deter Russia. And the reason I say deterrence might be failed is if Russia thinks it can if Russia sees an attack on a NATO member not as starting a new war, but a continuation or a escalation of the war it has now, it's essentially rolling the iron dice, which people often attribute to the German Chancellor before World War I, but it actually is a Confederate general statement from the American Civil War. Which is important to remember because I think we're forgetting that war is often a game of chance. And if Russia thinks it can take the chance that maybe NATO won't defend itself, will not gather to put its full weight behind an aggression, even if it seems unlikely, and even if NATO is in European NATO members have rebuilt their militaries to a significant degree that mathematically they can fight Russia, if Russia thinks it has even a slight chance to succeed at breaking the Western alliance by seizing Narva, even something small like that, it will take it. And so when I say we need to move beyond thinking about deterrence, it's not that we have to ignore deterrence or not try to deter Russia, but we need to have more. The Europe and the United States, NATO, whatever political entities involved, need to have a more serious step past deterrence, a more serious war plan. Previous war plans for defending the Baltic states are inadequate because they do not work towards how the Russians would do it. The letting the Russians take Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and then hoping to liberate it is not an adequate defense. That's why the Baltic states are, of course, investing so heavily in fixed fortifications. It's why all these countries are pulling out of the international treaties forbidding the use of landmines. That's good because that's not, I actually don't consider that deterring Russia. I think if you're putting thousands of landmines and concrete fortifications on your border, which I think the production of those needs to be stood up and the construction needs to be expedited. It's deterring in the sense that you're saying that when the Russians come across the border, and I say when, not if, because I think it should be viewed as a when statement now. You're inflicting real costs on them, not vague threats of inflicting costs.
It's like an
Unfortunately,
active
European
deterrence, right?
yeah, it's a more active deterrence, and I think after deterrence you have war fighting. It's preemptive war fighting in a way. And I'm not advocating for a preemptive attack on Russia, but as much as you can be preemptive in your defense in a real meaningful way, not in discussing what treaties, but having real or it would be enacted, but having real war plans is the next step. Both because it's a real threat, and also I think psychologically that's the step that European polities need to take. Is you cannot be as paranoid as the Russians are and how they talk about how they're at war with the West, but in our own way, liberal democracies need to recognize it's not, we need to stop using terms like adversary and competitor when it comes to Russia. The term is enemy. I think our strategic thinking needs to reflect that reality.
Thank you, Michael. Here I would like to return the mic to Juraj, and I think we will wrap up and transfer little by little to questions and answer sessions, as we see that some of the questions are already or repeating themselves or really are interesting to our audience. Juraj, I would like for you to start and also take one of the questions from the questions and answer session, as first one is directed to you about Hungary and Slovakia's government threats to EU militarization in legal EU field. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Just to respond to Mark's comments on deterrence, I really like the active deterrence approach. Also in the domain of gray zone war or hybrid warfare, and the fact that it's sort of an excuse not to do anything about it. And I think now we're more often trapped in this logic of resilience, saying that okay, we need to be resilient, we need to be able to absorb the shocks and then withstand it, but we never talk about how to actively fight back. And this is also something European states should consider. How shall we have our own offensive capabilities, and how shall we target the not of course I'm not saying we should sink the ships that cut the cables, but I think we should have much more robust response. And I think what for the Finnish and then Estonians that did with the with the tanker, but finished with the ship that cut the cables in the Baltic, the connector in the Baltic Sea. I think this is something that we should be actively doing and actively going after the perpetrators of these acts. These are not, we don't have to attribute them to Russia. I know this is of course very difficult, but you can always fight back. These are people that are the operations that are done on behalf by non-states on behalf of the Russian state, and I think we should be able to fight back, not only be resilient. Second point, the deterrence. Sure, I think that's another narrative. I think we also trap in that we always talking about deterring Russia, but about preparedness. But I think it's about being war ready. Are we able to fight back? Are we able not only to, as Michael has said, as was until now, the defense plans for the Baltics, do more than just absorb the shock and then regain it after we gain some political courage and also military might. So I think this is something that we should be doing more. I know, and it's also it requires us to answer difficult questions. Until recently, Europe was defending the landmines convention. Now we are withdrawing from it. So it's a lot of paradigm shifts still, and how we view or also our own role. And Europe, has still had, and for good reason, this attitude as our approach of a peace-loving continent. But I think if you want to defend peace, you should prepare prepare for a war. So I agree. This is important paradigm shift, both in hybrid warfare, in deterrence, in how we call things, and sometimes we have to call the spade a spade. And then now a question about Hungary and Slovakia. And I think you see that the response is just in front of our eyes. We saw, and Alexander Stubb, who has been already mentioned here, Finnish president, who said that the European defense will look like with not necessarily with a NATO framework, but within the European framework as EU plus minus, meaning EU plus countries like Norway, like UK, like Iceland, minus countries like Hungary, like unfortunately also my home country Slovakia. We see coalitions of the willing that are being, we don't exactly know what their role will be, but Slovakia and Hungary participate in this. So I think we will see emergence of these fora outside of the organizations that can be hindered by Slovak or Hungarian veto. And this will go from the sanctions, like maybe we'll see governments adopting sanctions unilaterally. An agreement but bypassing European Council, and the same way maybe in defense matters where Slovakia or Hungary can be troublemakers. So I think as long as there is political unity of the remaining 25 players plus UK plus Norway, I don't think Hungary and Slovakia can seriously hinder this, because they will always find a way to cooperate. But this is very sad, because we have these institutions to work, and it undermines the institutions, and it only plays to the hands of the Kremlin in the long term.
Thank you very much, Juraj, for your answer. I think we should really proceed with the questions and answer session. So I will continue with the questions that are here in our chat. The next question we're gonna review is gonna be from Batu Kutela. Any long-term peace and stability in Europe goes through Russian military defeat and trying the regime like Nazi regime and dismantling the root cause of its aggression, mutated Soviet system that is powered by the public support. This is the only chance for the Russian people to have normal country. Do you think Europe is ready for this scenario? If not, how to make this their priority strategic goal? Maria, do you think it is possible to make it Europe's strategic goal? Is there any possible understanding of this in European capitals currently?
Well, as I've said, it's a very unpopular topic in the West and in Europe in particular, in the US too, because even though the collapse of the Soviet Union that many people had feared really strongly proved to be quite peaceful, relatively smooth, with some caveats, of course. But even though that went pretty well, there are very strong fears now based on myths, stereotypes, and some kind of general anxiety, which is not very rational. But there is this feeling and fear that if some political change takes place in Russia, Russia will collapse, disintegrates, and there will be a powerful nuclear threat immediately created for the rest of the world, which I can't agree with, because it is Putin and it's the very stable Russian autocracy that poses a threat, because it's him who has used nuclear blackmail against us. And this very system where you have one person or three people taking crucial decisions, this is not very predictable and reliable system. So we should be vitally interested in making Russia really stable, meaning a decentralized country, with more equally distributed power and resources. But for some reason, I can't quite understand why there is no learning curve based on the last decades and general developments within Russia and outside Russia. So there is still this powerful fear and this bugbear of Russian collapse, and this bugbear of something like an Armageddon immediately, breaking out. So I think the only way to to change this stance is to, well, talk and explain all the time. But also, I think that Europeans will not change their attitude unless they actually see that something is happening within Russia and it doesn't lead to any kind of catastrophe. I can't see another way of like changing this fallacious attitude, which is not very optimistic, but I think this is what we are facing now.
Thank you. I think we should switch to another questions from Valentin. Question to Mr. DiCianna. Could Trump's efforts to normalize relations with Russia be viewed by Trump? Could it be linked to Trump's wish to end the war as a way for the US to bring Russia in US orbit for opposing China as another hegemony? Could this be linked to Trump's wish? One second. To end the war as soon as possible, sometimes with missing the importance of how it will be ended for.
So on the trying to normalize relations of Russians to sort of pivot against China, it talked about a lot is the reverse Kissinger move. I'll answer that in three parts. Do I think that that is the Trump plan? I think there are elements of the Trump administration that see that as the plan. In the Republican primary, Vivek Ramaswamy was one of the first people to propose that. He sort of put that out into the atmosphere, though he's not I don't believe he is a serious advisor to Trump on foreign policy now. I've seen it in some journals, some think pieces, some op-eds have proposed some sort of reverse Kissinger. Uh, I think that idea exists. I don't know if that's Trump's plan for ending the. I don't think that's Trump's goal behind normalizing relations. I do think Trump is very serious about wanting to end the war because I think for the reasons I said before, he thinks the war is bad and destructive and needs to stop as soon as possible. Though he might be coming around to realizing the difficulty of that because of Russia. Do I think that that's a solid plan? Obviously, no. I think it's a flawed plan. I'm of the camp that the original Nixon going to China was a mistake during the Cold War because it delineated for the United States and the United States public the idea that there were good communists and bad communists. And the long-term effect has been the rise of this dangerous Chinese Communist Party. And I think the idea of trying to go to Russia and having the world be there good totalitarians and bad totalitarians that threaten their neighbors of invasion would be a mistake of a scale that we cannot quite fathom. So if that is the effort, I believe it will fail because I don't think that there are cracks in the Sino-Russian relationship, which of course the Sino-Soviet split had been in place for about 15 years, more actually, almost 20 years before Kissinger and Nixon went to China. There were border skirmishes, there were ideological differences between the Chinese Communist Party and the Soviet Communist Party. There is friction of sort between Russia and China. You can point to occasionally China draws maps that show them reclaiming some of the territory that was taken from that is in Russian Siberia now that was previously part of Chinese empires. There's grievances that might have to be addressed at some point, especially as if China continues to decline while Russia continues to decline. I spoke about before, sort of the mortgaging of Russia's future for this war. But other than those long-term trajectories, and there's not really there's daylight between Russia and China, obviously on various international issues, but there's not a break yet, and I don't think there's anything resembling a break that can be shattered. So if that's the plan, I'm not sure, but I think anyone proposing that plan seriously will be quickly disillusioned unless you're so committed to the idea of some sort of great Russia model that exists in some members of the American right, but I think that their influence is, I don't want to say overstated, but I think it is not. They are not consistently the drivers of Trump foreign policy. So,
All right. Thank you very much, Michael. I think as we are nearing to the end of our allotted time, I think we should take one more question to answer. All other questions that weren't answered, we are going to be compiled and used also for our future events. So if you had any other questions that you were shy to ask during the event, we will also share the feedback form after this event, so you could share them there. And while preparing for other events, while preparing our other articles and papers, we will 100% use them as ideas for our future activities. So please do share them after the event, share them in chat. I think a very important question was also asked here. What happened if Russia, for example, attacked not the European country, not the Baltics, not where we actually awaited, but Georgia, for example? I would like Juraj, Majcin to take this question, and after that, we're going to be wrapping up our meeting.
The question is whether what would be the reaction if Russia attacks a non-EU or non-NATO country, right? So I think we witness it now with Ukraine. This is, I hope that if Russia, actually Russia has already attacked Georgia, so that there's ongoing occupation of Georgia, and you can see really the difference between Western reaction in 2008 and the reaction with Ukraine, which was completely different. And I think and I hope that the reaction if Russia attacks another state would be more like Ukraine, and even stronger than our reaction in 2008. That would be my my response in short.
Michael, you can add.
Yeah, just to quickly add to that, I'm not the first person to suggest it, but I think one area where Russia might try to test NATO European resolve could be, as I said before, starting something in the Balkans. Obviously, there is a NATO presence there with K4 in Kosovo. But yeah, the Russian-Serbian relationship is very close. President Vučić, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is a close personal friend to Putin. That's one way where Russia could just cause some sort of encourage some sort of thing to blow up. That would be a great way to test and see how serious Europe is about securing its borders, even beyond NATO, including in an area where there's been a long-term NATO presence. Like, how married is Brussels to keeping things calm down there? That would be a serious area where I'd consider the threat of Russian aggression being a real testing point.
Juraj, you could add.
Just briefly, this is not to give Vladimir Putin some ideas, but one other area, a geographic area where Russia might try to test us. It's also at NATO territory. To look, for instance, at Svalbard, where Russia has a coal mine. What happens if there is a fire in that coal mine, and then Russia would send firefighters? And what if they send the military? Would it, and they would establish presence there? Would it be considered that to be Article 5 situation? So high north and islands in the high north are also in areas where Russia could test us, and even could test NATO territory. So we should not forget about this either.
This is a great idea, unfortunately. As we reach the end of our time, I want to extend huge thanks to our incredible experts for their invaluable insights today. Your contributions have been, truly painted a comprehensive canvas of the Russian threats globally, and underscored very vital need for preparedness around. Thank you all, also to our audience, for your engagement and thoughtful questions. We hope this discussion has been as informative for you as it has been for us. Good evening, everyone. I hope you have a great day. Thank you once again to our experts.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great pleasure having you.
Pleasure
today.
speaking with you all.
Congratulations for the report. Again.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations. This is great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, goodbye, everyone.